Hi everyone, my name is Adam Baus. I'm with the Office of Health Services Research at West Virginia University School of Public Health. This is a supplemental learning session for our Pacific Chronic Disease Coalition partners. This is specifically about using the Crosswalk editor in CDEMS. And I'm making this video in response to some questions that we've had recently about making modifications to the registry and some of its functions. So this is intended to help with those questions and to help keep discussion going. And so I always encourage everyone to feel free to contact our office as they're using the registry or have questions. We're very glad to help. My contact information will be at the close of these slides, and I'm always happy to hear from you and help out as I can. I would like to acknowledge the Pacific Chronic Disease Council and all of the leadership and the wonderful partners that are part of this group. Our office is delighted and privileged to be part of this, so thank you for having us as part of that team, and my thanks also to Gwen Hosey for her leadership and constant support to everyone. Okay, so here's our scenario. Let's consider that you want to add or edit criteria associated with one or more of the diagnoses, labs, measures, prescriptions, services, or vitals tracked in your CDEMS registry. And for the sake of learning, let's consider one specific measure for now, HbA1c. So we'll review the Crosswalk editor together, looking at the various components of HbA1c specifically that can be customized. And here's some of the major things that we'll cover tonight. So we'll look at the way in which HbA1c results are displayed on the goal letter and how you can change that. We'll look at information displayed on the recommended care guidelines form for HbA1c and how you can modify that. We'll look at the graphing for that particular lab and how the minimum and maximum scales of that graph can be modified. And lastly, we'll also look at data quality and flagging during data entry. So if you or your team are entering lab results, for example, and something is miskeyed, you can have a prompt asking you if that is indeed the entry that you meant to key in. Okay, so I'm going to step through some slides and then we'll look at the Crosswalk editor together for these specific examples. So this is a screenshot of the goal letter, or a stoplight letter as some folks call it. So you can see that HbA1c is a component of that letter. It's generated through the CDEMS application. That's one of the main forms that you can print out per patient. And you can see on this goal letter you have some information about that test. Notably, it shows up as, for this particular sample patient, their result is 7.5, so that stoplight shows up as yellow, and the goal noted there specifically is that ideally it would be less than 6.5 to 7%. Well, maybe that's okay for your clinic or your team, and maybe it's not. Perhaps you want the stoplight letter coloring to behave differently, and maybe you want the text mentioned there for the goal to be different. Using the Crosswalk editor, we can change that, and we'll look at that together. Here's a screenshot of the recommended care guidelines. So you can see HbA1c is also part of that form. You have that same goal reference, less than 6.5 to 7. And under the importance of the test, you can see that it's empty. Well, maybe neither of those things are good. You may want to add a note about why the test is important, and maybe again you want that goal reference range to be different. Very modifiable, and we can do that together. And here's an example of the graph scaling. So this is a screenshot of the HbA1c that's being charted for a patient. You can see on the graph that on March the 5th of this year, the result was 7. On January the 26th, the result was 7.5. And on October 6th of last year, the result was 8.3. So those are potentially some very significant clinical changes, going from 8.3 down to 7. That's, for that patient, that could be a huge success. On this graph, however, those changes could be obscured somewhat because the range goes from 0 to 15. And technically, your axis should start at 0, but it doesn't have to always. So if you're interested in showing HbA1c results that start at something higher, you can do that. Or likewise, if the top range of 15, maybe it's too low, you could also increase that range. So we'll look at how to do that together. And data quality flagging. I think this is a very good feature of the registry. Here's a screenshot of an HbA1c that was accidentally entered as 82 rather than 8.2. And that's very easy to do. You can miss a decimal. It happens to us all. But whenever we went to save it, you see that we were prompted with a message that the value appears to be out of range. So 82 is definitely not between 3 and 15. So again, you have some general parameters that you can put on your lab results or other types of data, that if you're entering data and you want to make sure that the data quality are a little bit better at the outset, you can set up flagging like that. So everything that we'll look at together is in the CDEMS application, in the Utility tab, and it's the Crosswalk Editor button that we'll look at more closely together. And this is the screen. I'll jump over to the registry in a moment, but this is the screen for the Crosswalk Editor specifically for HbA1c. And you can see a lot of various fields just for that one lab value. So what we'll do together, we'll look at this. I'll walk through each of those fields with you, and then we can talk again about the screens that we were looking at previously relative to the information included here. So my contact information is there. My email is abaus@hsc.wvu.edu. We've also been doing a fair amount of remote support with partners and Skype calls, which are also excellent to do. I'm glad to provide any level of support that I can along the way for this type of issue and other registry needs as we go forward together. Okay, so now we're looking at the CDEMS application. So first, to get to the Crosswalk Editor, we click on the Utility tab, and here we are, Crosswalk Editor. And it says use this command to open the Crosswalk setup to refine registry settings. We'll click on that. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do when we come here is think about the kind of data that we want to modify. So the first box at the very top says select type code. So the registry is organized based on the type of data that it stores. So here we have the chance to modify information on the diagnoses, tracked, laboratory values, measures, prescriptions, services, and the vitals of those patients. So again, we're talking about HbA1c just as a learning example. So I'll click on Lab. Okay. So now the second box down, called raw code, it's limited now to only the labs in your registry. So here's HbA1c. When I click that, you see all of those settings that we were looking at in the PowerPoint. So here's our lab, HbA1c, And you'll see that there are text tips that pop up for each of these fields along the way, and those tell you exactly what those fields mean. So in this case, the working code, that's used to display, it's a display label used to better interpret the raw codes. So the raw codes are the sort of codified versions of the measures, and the working codes are the ones that are more spelled out and more appropriate. So you can see the raw code is simply an HA1C. That's from the original coding from Washington State, whereas we've altered the working code to be HbA1c, something more appropriate. The next box down is a lab code. The lab codes are for electronic download of laboratory tests, and those are specific to each lab company. So what you're seeing here are a variety of lab codes. I believe these are all for LabCorp. So if there is opportunity to import laboratory data into the registry, that's always a fantastic thing if it's available. And that's, as a side note, that's something that we'd always be glad to explore with you. But the codes can vary by company. Even within company, you can have multiple codes for the same lab. So this is where we list out those codes. So when we run that lab interface, it knows what codes to look for and where to map it back to in the data file. Okay, so now then, so thinking back on the goal letter, the stoplight letter, and I'll go back to that for a moment. So when we looked at the stoplight letter, we could see that for the HbA1c, the result was 7.5 and it was yellow. Well, here's how that happens. So we have three fields here: good, sort of fair, or poor, and then something just simply called bad. So those are, relatively crude ways of categorizing in three ways laboratory values. So you can see here less than 7 means good, and that's how our less than 7 means good. And that's how our laboratory values for HbA1c become green. If something is between 7.1 and 8.9, those are yellow. And if something is greater than 9, it will be red. So if we wanted to alter that, this is where we would do it, right here. We just need to be careful that our ranges are exclusive of each other and inclusive of all of the possible values that we could find. Now, standard alert. Remember a few slides back we saw that 82 was not between 3 and 15? Well, here's where that happens. So the standard alert lets us change that error checking range. So maybe you want to be sure that your HbA1cs are actually between 4 and 19 instead, whatever plausible values you might have. You can edit that here. The standard frequency is a flagging system for how often those labs should occur. So here we have it set for 90, and this is how the red flagging happens on the progress note. So if you're thinking about HbA1c and you want that to happen every 3 months, you can set it for 90. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're thinking about colonoscopy and you want that to happen every 10 years, you could set that specifically for a much larger point in time. Something in a more practical sense, if you're thinking about lipid panel, maybe that happens every 6 months, every 180 days. So the guidelines that you and your team are following could be taken into account, whatever those national guidelines are that you have in mind, and entered here. The standard color, that's not something that we use frequently, but on the progress note, if you would like the labeling for any specific measure to stand out, you could do that here. So the possible colors are red, blue, green, yellow, black, and orange. So if you simply type in those colors here on the progress note, that's how the labeling for HbA1c would now appear, just to help it to stand out. The standard drop-down is not something that you would really use for a lab value because those are numeric and there really is no standard drop-down for data collection. On the other hand, if you were collecting something like colonoscopy or a colorectal cancer screening and you wanted to know about the specific modality of that screening, this is where you could enter that. So in the case of colonoscopy, you would have possibly, in the case of colorectal cancer screening, you would have choices such as colonoscopy, fecal occult blood test, FIT test, etc. And for each of those entries, you would simply separate them with a semicolon. So when you use that drop-down in the data entry form, you would see those choices. But again, not relevant for labs. The HbA1c 3-month control label, we could see that here under the test or service description. That appears here, and it also appears on the stoplight letter. So if you would like to change these labels in the letters, again, this is where you could do that. You can see on about the standard comment short, it says less than 6.5. It says less than 6.5 to 7. That appears right here in the goal, less than 6.5 to 7. Maybe if we want to change that, we could edit that. And remember how the importance of test line was blank? We can also change that. So maybe you want the goal to be less than, maybe you want it to just say less than 7% for clarity, and this, for a longer comment, perhaps you would like it to say important for diabetes control, something simple like that. We can note that. And then the last two fields in here, the minimum scale and the maximum scale, this is where our graphing comes in. So our minimum scale set to 0, and the maximum, you can see it's one step up, it's actually 16. And here's where that happens. So if you wanted that graph to be compressed to show the change more readily, you could start it at 5, for example. And when you're done making those changes, you can click on Save, and you're done. So we can go back to Print and Preview. So if we want to look at the graph for that same sample patient, we'll preview that and take a look at the changes that we made in that Crosswalk editor. Okay, so you can see under Goal, now it now says less than 7 instead of 6.5 to 7. And under the importance of test, you can see that's now filled in. It says important for diabetes control. And our chart, our graph is different, right? It now starts at 5. So the same data that was graphed before, you can see a little bit more in terms of the change. So you could graph those data more like between 5 and 15, just to show the change, or you could leave it at 0. We do really recommend that graphs be left at 0, but I'm just showing you what those options are to change the way in which those data are displayed. So about the data entry. So if we're entering data, HbA1c data, again, in maybe the result, we try to enter 7.5, but accidentally type in 75. When you go to save it, you can see it asks you to pause for a second. 75 is not between 4 and 19. So here's the new ranges that we entered just a few minutes ago. And you can add it anyway if you say yes, but if you say no, you get a chance to go back, 7.5, save it. And there's always opportunity to go back and edit your data as you need. Like if we were to go to edit and then edit labs, you can see here's the 7.5, or I'm sorry, here's the 7.5 that was just entered for today's date. So we could always go back and make those changes as we need to if we happen to miss it the first time. So I hope this is useful in terms of starting to get a sense for what the Crosswalk editor offers. But as you have questions, as you're trying this out, I'm very glad to take those questions and to help you along the way. It's really an honor to work with you all. We mean that. So as you have questions, please keep us posted, and we'll look forward to talking with you and corresponding with you over email and talking with you over Skype. So take good care, and thanks again.